We now want to talk about how to build strong ecosystems through experimentation, and this is basically through the experience of the Innovation Growth Labs. We would like to do it with Albert Bravo-Biosca from Nesta, this Innovation Foundation. Albert, whenever you want, please, stage is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me here. We have some slides here. Maybe let me start asking you to reflect a little bit about how does your organization make decisions? How do you get to decisions? What it is that you do in your own organization? Are they based on intuition? Intuition meaning visionary leadership. Intuition meaning the voice of experience. We've done this. Are they based on stories? The stories that you hear customers telling you, companies you support explaining, the stories that you hear your employees sharing, the stories you hear, you read in the media, or the stories that you hear that people in Silicon Valley are doing, and therefore we should as well. Or do you use data? Data to understand really what your organization is doing in real time, to understand what's happening in the ecosystem, to understand how those two actually come together. Or last but not least, do you use evidence? Not only have data, but actually know what's causing what. You understand that if you do something, something else would happen. You understand what drives change, what drives the behavior. Now, I should clear. To us, good judgment is not using one of these. Good judgment is knowing how to combine them effectively. And the challenge that we often see in the world that we work is that there is a lot of organizations supporting ecosystems in the public sector, in the private sector, but I think that also applies to many companies that use intuition and stories much more than they use data and evidence. So part of what IGL will try to do is balance the scale a little bit. We believe that intuition and stories have a place. They are important. They are useful. But that we also have to use data and evidence. And this is underutilized. One of the things, I guess, whenever you're presenting, for those of you that are more in venture capital entrepreneurship, you have to size the price, the market, what's the win? So let me maybe kind of do a little bit of an analogy here. If you look at across Europe and you look at how much European governments are investing in supporting businesses to innovate, to grow, you get 150,000 millions, so 150 billion, whatever you want to do it. And that's quite a substantial investment. You start asking yourself a few questions. The first one is, are we getting the most from it? You have the European Commission, you have the Spanish government, you have all the European governments investing a lot. But then we look at productivity statistics and scale-ups, and one can be left wondering, is this really achieving as much impact as it could? You can also ask yourself whether we're investing a lot of money. Are we actually doing R&D about how to invest this money effectively? We have policymakers telling the European Commission and others sort of saying we should invest much more in R&D, companies should invest much more in R&D, societies should invest much more in R&D. Do we have the governments themselves, the organizations that support ecosystems, the SEDETIs, the Accions, the Red.es, the investing themselves in R&D to improve the impact of these massive investments that they are doing? When we're spending this money, do we test in the way that we expect of researchers and innovations? Do we actually have open-minded? Do we explore different options? Do we evaluate them? And ultimately, going back to my prior slide, when we're actually allocating this money to programs, to policies, whether it's R&D tax credits, whether it's digital toolkits or kits digitals, are these decisions being guided by data and evidence, or are they being guided by intuition and stories? just to, I guess, put something into perspective, lots of what we do is about evidence, as probably you've guessed by now. We spend, there are a lot of evaluations that governments and other organizations do to understand the impact that this investment is having. Some colleagues at the London School of Economics looked at 15,000 of those, and they basically asked how many of those were actually good enough. And what do I mean by good enough? I mean, we can get into the technical parts, but I will not get there. By good enough, I mean they are good enough to convince someone that disagrees with you. So we do evaluate, we do test policies, we see what works and what doesn't work. But typically do it in a way that if you agree with the conclusion, you like the program and the evaluation says the program is working, you believe the evaluation. If you dislike the program and the evaluation say the program is working, you basically say, yeah, this evaluation is it's not good, I don't believe it, it has all these pitfalls. So the important when you are thinking about evaluating what works and what doesn't work is to ensure that you do it in a way that will convince the skeptics. There is no value in trying to convince the people who are already convinced about whether something works or doesn't work. And of those, they basically ask how many of these 15,000 evaluations satisfy this criteria. And what they saw is that of those 15,000, only something happened with the slide, but only 2.4% of those satisfied this criteria. So most of the evaluations that people do to evaluate policies in the space are good enough to put in a press release, are good enough to convince the minister that this is something that is worth doing if he likes the idea, but they are not good enough to change someone's mind about the impact of the program. And crucially, of those, only 1 in 4 actually showed positive impacts in employment. These were evaluations of local economic growth schemes on this side, and on the other side, just looking at the innovation schemes. So what is AGL? What are we here? We are basically a global policy lab that works to drive more impactful innovation and productivity policies. We are basically, we sit in the world between, we sit at the intersection of the world of policy and the world of research. We have a bunch of government agencies from around the world that that are members of AGL and that are interested in improving the impact of their policies and programs through novel ideas, experimentation, data, and evidence. And then we have a large research network with over 150 researchers from around the world that love to collaborate with policymakers and practitioners and ecosystem organizations to help them understand what works and what doesn't. Our vision is that we believe that effective government agencies, effective organizations are agile, are experimental, are data-driven, and are evidence-based. And this is probably quite uncontroversial, but it's quite difficult to find in reality. It is when you look at public sector organizations, if you look at government agencies across the OECD, there are many that are trying to go towards this direction, but there are very few that have gotten there. It is as well, sometimes if you look at private sector organizations in this space as well. So what does this mean? And what does AGL do? Part of our work is to try to transform organizations so they achieve more impact, and that means changing how they think. And here's there's a long list. I'm not going to go through those. You can, but it's changing the mentality from going from output focused, where we count activities, to impact focused, where we actually measure impacts, outcomes. It goes from changing the culture and mentality of asking ourselves, why change? Why bother? Versus and have no space for new ideas. Versus constantly asking ourselves, what if? And that means us as an organization, but also us as people within the organization. It means moving from a world where we are quite static, change is exception, there is inertia, to moving to a world where it is much more dynamic, where change is the norm. It means thinking of failure different. Failure not something that should paralyze you, but failure as something that it's that it's required and it will happen if you want to do some innovation. There was one innovation agency that we were talking to a few years ago that they were telling they were telling us that they were worried. They were having too much success, and they felt they were not taking enough risks. So having too much success for the press department, for the minister, if everyone you are supporting as an innovation agency is being very successful, That looks very good when you are, you're talking to the media, when you are in parliament, talking to the opposition. But that probably demonstrates that you are not taking enough risk, because innovation is risky and failure is part of it. And that applies when we are supporting others, but also applies when we are doing this in our own organization. Something where we see a lot is, it's transforming organizations from being overconfident to experimental. What do I mean by overconfident? Many policy makers assume that they have the answer to the problem they're trying to fix, or pretend that they have it. Maybe they may know they're not having. So they start with a single solution. Let's call it Kit Digital. That will solve the digitization challenge of the Spanish small businesses. And they assume that this will work. The alternative is to become much more experimental, to explore multiple paths, rather than assuming that you know what's going to work, to test them, to see, is option A better than option B? Again, not rocket science, but quite rare still in this policy space. There is a lot about risk as well. Organizations, a lot of organizations think risk is to be avoided. I think in Spanish we have this saying of quien se mueve no sale en la foto. So you shouldn't try, don't check things up. Even if in reality we know that this is more risky, versus risk is something that you have to manage. You need to take small risks to avoid larger risks. That also means thinking about how we learn as an organization. For many organizations, learning is almost like an accident. It's unplanned, it's ad hoc. You do a report, it sits in a drawer somewhere. Versus learning, you learn by design. You are really intentional. You are structured. You do this continuously. You use those lessons to improve the programs. Last, it means moving from a world where organizations have very little information about what's happening. They don't have a data infrastructure, they don't have skills, to have a very data-rich environment. So, knowing in real time what's happening inside with their activities, but also what's happening outside and how the two connect to each other. It means moving from weak evaluation, where you're basically asking people, are you happy with this money that the government gave you? Was it helpful? And people we know, they like to be polite. They like, sure, yes, that was very helpful. That was very, please continue giving. They also like to continue getting money, so yes, please continue getting money, giving money and support from me. And also, they don't know what would have happened without it. We sometimes assume that giving lots of money to companies is a good idea, but sometimes that insulates them from talking to customers. And maybe if you had looked for a lead customer, they may have been much more effective than having gotten this additional R&D grant. Maybe not. That's the point. We should test those. Last but not least, it means moving from being quite close, so very protective, with very limited external engagement, to collaborative, recognizing that the good ideas on how to support ecosystems come very often from the outside, come from the people who are talking to businesses, from the businesses themselves, from the innovators, comes from what other governments are doing, comes from the evidence that academics have generated. It's changing these mindsets that basically it's what we're trying to do with AGL. So our work is global. We've worked with over 50 government agencies worldwide to help them become more experimental and data-driven. We've supported a bunch of 70+ policy experiments in 28 countries. We've tried to convince governments and successfully convinced governments from the European Commission to the UK government to start funding policy experiments and opening up their policy process to see what works and what doesn't. And as part of our work, we've tried to raise awareness and convince thousands of policymakers from lots of countries to do things differently and to build a global community that brings all these people that basically want to help accelerate this transformation together. I've talked a lot about experiments, but I haven't really explained you what we mean by that and why they are valuable. Basically, for many of the things that we try to do, and that applies whether you are an organization giving business support or entrepreneurship support or innovation support or even inside a big private sector organization, so whether we are in the public or the private sector, is very often we have a lot of challenges that don't have clear solutions. And the typical approach, okay, my screen got off, but this one is working, that's good. But the typical approach is you just pick one, you bring everyone in the room, you put them in for one morning inside the room, and you basically ask them, let's come up with a solution, we develop it. You may ask a couple of people for feedback, and then you go ahead with it. When you're doing this, you don't know whether other options could have worked better, whether there would be additional solutions that could be explored, whether they might have been better. Who knows? So that's why experimentation is a useful thing. And actually, when we started AGL, we tended to encounter lots of reluctance to experimentation. Now, when we talk to policymakers, we hear a lot of, yes, yes, we are experimenting constantly. Last year, we tried this, and this year, we're trying this, that, and that. But the way they are using this word is to say experimentation is trying something new. So yeah, they are doing a pilot here, a pilot there. They are exploring, but what they are not doing. And I once, as you know by now, I'm not a native English speaker, so I checked the dictionary. Is to see what an experiment actually means if you look at it at the dictionary. And what it means is a test done in order to learn something or to discover whether something works or is true. Which means that it's not, an experiment is not trying something new. An experiment is actually testing whether something is working. Learning is the priority. You are intentionally testing a hypothesis in a structured way, and you have some timeframes to do that. And this is much more rare than how many government agencies talk about experimentation. So, getting there, this is about the mindset, what if, the culture, the organization flexibility and openness to failure, the methods, how you learn. And there are kind of different ways of doing. But one of the ones that has become very fashionable in lots of policy areas in the last few years is the idea of testing policies and programs in the same way that we test vaccines and drugs. So the idea of using randomized controlled trials where we take an intervention and we test whether, and we test it with a control group to see whether it's working or not. We do this a lot, for vaccines, for drug treatments. We are doing this increasingly a lot in social programs and in education programs. We do this very little in policies that aim to accelerate science, innovation, and productivity. So, the idea, for those of you that may be not familiar, is a simple one. You take a bunch of entrepreneurs, a bunch of companies, and you sort of say, you see which ones are eligible for the program that you want to do, and you sort of say, okay, on phase one, when I'm doing the pilot, rather than giving this to everyone, I'm going to put them in a pot, I'm going to draw a lottery, and randomly assign them to different treatment interventions. Some people may get the intervention of, they will get some training on how to do a business plan. Some people may get an intervention on how to build social skills. Some people may be in the control group. Then you see what happened to those entrepreneurs, to those companies, and you evaluate what works and what doesn't. And you can do them to evaluate, but you can also do them to optimize. I mean, companies do it all the time, all the time with many companies, not all, surprisingly, do it all the time, with A/B testing. You can also use those to understand what works, the context, the problem you're trying to fix. So just to give you a few specific examples, one of the questions that people have is, how do collaborations emerge? How much search cost there is in collaborations? Is the level of collaboration that we see within academia, or that we see, between academia and businesses, the right level of collaboration? So, and are there some kind of frictions? So, some researchers from at Harvard University, that are in our network, a few years ago, they basically tested how do these collaborations emerge. And the way they did it was to sort of say, look, we're going to set up a new funding call for science, for research, but we're going to require anyone who wants to apply to come to this information session. And at this information session, we're basically going to ask them to sit in different rooms and to talk to each other. So the intervention was a very simple intervention. It was to say, if you want to apply for this funding, you have to come here, and we'll put you in different rooms randomly, and we'll force you to talk to other academic researchers. That simple intervention almost doubled the propensity of collaboration between academic researchers. And I guess the last bit of the story is that all those were researchers at the Harvard Medical School. So even in a context where people operate in the same space, are members of the same faculty, are eat at the same canteen, even in that context, a small tweak in the process can get much more collaboration. Now kind of zoom out and think about what you could do if you're thinking about how you encourage collaboration between scientists from different centers, whether you are, let's say, the Barcelona Institute of Science and Technology, BIST, or how do you encourage collaboration between industry and universities. There are a lot of experiments currently testing what's the impact of AI to try to understand how does AI improve business performance. One that I like very much, that is very recent, is from a researcher from MIT, actually a PhD student from MIT, has been testing what's the impact of AI in scientific discovery. How do you accelerate scientific discovery? And here, what they've done has been to give an AI tool to researchers working in material science. And they sort of said, half of them, well, they've staggered the release, so some of them have gotten it first, some of them got it, but later. They've just seen the impact that this was having in the speed of discovering new materials. And the impacts are staggering. But without the experiment, we would never know. You can also think about experimentation for optimization. Something that very few governments do is A/B testing. Sometimes a single tweak in the language that you put in your newsletter will get you, in that case, in the case of the UK government, an additional 9,000 applicants just from tweaking the language. Sometimes you can optimize, for instance, how you do selection processes for funding. A really nice experiment that someone in the network did tested how to unlock additional funding for female-owned startups. First, they noticed that in panels, in those contexts, but it was it was in several countries, they noticed that the judges in funding competitions typically ask different types of questions to women entrepreneurs and male entrepreneurs. Male entrepreneurs got, on average, more opportunistic-oriented questions. Female entrepreneurs were more kind of prevention-oriented questions. What may go wrong? The simple experiment they did was to sort of just test, what if we basically give judges an interview guide? Does this change the scores? And just giving judges an interview guide that forced them to ask the same type of questions to both male-owned startups and female-owned startups, in that context, it did change the scores of the judges about how good the companies were. So this was not about let's change women to pitch differently. There is a debate out there on how this works. This was let's change the system so it's actually much more open to diversity and less biased. You can also think about experiments to think about impact evaluation. And here, a classical one was the idea of innovation vouchers. That's something that the UK government, the Dutch government did. Axio is also done here in Barcelona. And the idea was, companies did apply for this voucher, and this voucher basically gives them some money to go to university and pay for services from universities to collaborate with them. And what they found out was that in the short term, giving this voucher, and companies applied, and among all that were eligible, that was among all that were eligible, they used a lottery, and they randomly allocated them. Those that who won the lottery were collaborating more with universities. And what's interesting in the case of the Netherlands, they did follow in the long term, and they saw that that a small voucher of like 10,000 euros, 7 years earlier, actually impacted the R&D intensity of those companies 8 years later. So some small changes at the right time can create lots of long-term effects. Last example I will give is about, last but not least, is about an intervention that we supported first in Italy, then in the UK, and now it has been tested in different countries, looking at teaching entrepreneurs the scientific approach. So this is almost like a meta-experiment. I've been making the case that making organizations to be much more experimental, data-driven, is good. This experiment actually demonstrates this is the case not just if you're thinking about government organizations, about the government agencies, but also if you're thinking about businesses. So businesses, entrepreneurs, whether they were startups or small businesses that got this type of training, were much more likely to pivot, which might be more likely to adapt their strategy than those that didn't. When we talk about experimentation, we always, most people now tend to be very favorable at things that others are not. In practice, there is a bit of a bias, and in the sense that I think it's okay, but others will not like it, therefore I'm not going to do it. It's just a point to make. It's worth doing it, and don't be so afraid, because actually people like it more than you think. So we do work in lots of different areas, and I will skip, will not go into details for this. We do work on the space of science, innovation, productivity, industry, and entrepreneurship policies. But there are 4 areas, for those of you that are in the room, that we are kind of prioritizing, particularly right now. So are things like, how do we make science innovation funding more effective? And we have a program that is supporting a bunch of experiments in this area. We'll be launching in January a handbook on how we can use experiments to accelerate science and university, university industry collaboration and science commercialization. So what type of experiments can we see to increase the motivation, capabilities, resources of researchers and businesses, and to improve the matching process? So please join us. We are working a lot on how do we create more opportunities for people from different backgrounds to access the innovation system, to contribute to the innovation system, and we have a bunch of experiments in the UK that we'd love to replicate here. And last but not least, we're also working a lot on getting kind of technology adopted by small businesses. The last thing I guess I'll say is, hopefully you are convinced that successful organizations, explore, experiment, learn, and scale. This is not rocket science. It's easy to say, it's more difficult to do. What I like to add is that building ecosystems is no different. And I think we have the opportunity to turn Barcelona into a citywide lab where the different organizations that support the ecosystem, whether they are in the public sector, whether in the private sector, whether they are somewhere in between, become experimental themselves and constantly use experimentation and data to develop more effective interventions. So if you're interested in some of these, please drop us a line. We'll be very happy to explore.
Thank you.